Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sergio Alcocer. I'm the president of the Mexican Council of Foreign Relations, and it is my distinct pleasure for me to welcome you to this webinar in which the case and path of development for AllyShoring will be discussed. This is an event that is co-hosted by the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, which is a very relevant organization led by a very good friend of ours, Enrique Perret, and that is very significant, his work on improving the relation between both of our countries, and particularly related to trade and to the work that immigrants do related to improving the well-being of our countries. And today we'll be discussing one of the topics that had been in place after the COVID or during the COVID-19, which is how to improve shoring and reshoring of value chains in North America, particularly between Mexico and the US. So for me, it is a pleasure to welcome the US-Mexico Foundation. I wanted to stay longer during the meeting. Unfortunately, I have to run to another meeting that I had not expected to have. But I'm sure that Enrique and Jorge Armijo, who are here, they will do the great job of introducing, first of all, our speakers, which I'm very thankful to them to be with us, and also to conduct and to moderate the discussion and the Q&A. So thank you very much. Thank you very much on behalf of COMEXI for this opportunity, Enrique, and please, you have the floor.
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you to the COMEXI for hosting this event. We have been working on this document, on this narrative of AllyShoring for the last, I think, 4 to 5 months. And we have been presenting this document and all the narrative to different organizations and stakeholders. What we want, our main objective in the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, is to find the right narrative around trade between our two countries. And I think this is a very good tool, right? AllyShoring could be a very good tool in both sides of the border. So on behalf of the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, thank you to all of you listening to this seminar. I hope you find it very useful on your daily basis. And please, at the end, if you have any question, just prepare those questions. Last year, at the end of last year, and understanding the implementation and the new agreement of USMCA, and understanding different factors around not just North America, but the world now, the post-pandemic needs, and the tech race between China and US, and also the new tech platforms, right, on transportation and telecommunications, on semiconductors and other industries. We were looking for something that can fit quite well in this US-Mexico relationship, also with Canada. And you all know, the words of offshoring and nearshoring that helps a lot Mexico in the past 2 or 3 decades, specifically in industries like information technology. And then we start hearing here in the US the reshoring factor, the Buy America narrative, and there were this concept, AllyShoring, laid down by John and Elaine, and we saw it in a newspaper here in Washington, in the Hill. We said, in the U.S.-Mexico Foundation, we said this could be amazing for Mexico. So that's how we approached John and Elaine, and then they very kindly accepted to collaborate with the U.S.-Mexico Foundation and with a task force we created for this specific document. And so the result is the document you have in your hands or in your computer, and you will hear from John and Elaine all the ideas behind, all the benefits that we can have, not only in Mexico, but also US. There are needs in Mexico, but there are needs also in US, and that's the right fit that we see here, okay? So let me introduce formally John and Elaine. I mean, I will not take a lot of time on this because I prefer to hear from them. But John Austin is the director of the Michigan Economic Center. He's based in Detroit. He's non-resident senior fellow for Brookings Institution, and he is also a member of the Chicago Council of Global Affairs. He's a research fellow. And Elaine Desensky is the Chief Growth Officer. That's a very nice title, Elaine. Let me tell you, at Blank Slate Technologies, and she's also the founder of Lumirisk, an international risk advisory firm. But they have been working for many years in the Michigan region, in the automotive sector, in supply chains, and in different regions. Elaine spent a lot of time in China, so they know very well about reshoring, AllyShoring, and as President Joe Biden called it recently, the friendly shoring. I prefer AllyShoring, but friendly shoring sounds good also. So thank you very much, John, Elaine. The floor is all yours.
Great. Thanks, Enrique, and hello to everyone. And Sergio, thank you for the kind welcome. We're just delighted to be here. John and I actually just got back from a recent visit to Rapid City, South Dakota, where we presented the concept of AllyShoring to the Council of State Governments, to the Midwest division of that work, and we received a tremendous amount of positive feedback. So we've had a very steady stream of interest and engagement, but I think it really started when Enrique reached out to us, as he mentioned, in late 2020, having seen some of our writing. So John and I, just by way of a bit more background, have been writing together more than 12 years now. We met after I left the Department of Homeland Security around 2007, and we collaborated on a piece for the Brookings Institution around revitalizing the Great Lakes region. I also come from Michigan, so John and I share that, and we have shared interest in how we revitalize our industrial Midwest, and that has continued over the years. And pre-pandemic, we reconnected on some research that I had been doing around China, and specifically looking at how China's infrastructure investments around the world was starting to change the dynamic of development, really in some ways undermining the long-held global norms and standards around finance, development projects, and in the process eroding U.S. engagement and even leadership in some areas. And that research and exploration into the China Belt and Road Initiative and how that was really changing the landscape very quickly also moved into this topic of governance, and specifically how China was using some forms of corruption to move countries towards political positions on Taiwan, on Hong Kong, and even going as far as having influence into European governance structures. So when we think about China and how they're growing, it's not just in Asia and even Africa, but it's even gone into Europe. And all of this was quite interesting. And what John and I talked about in the context of this research is how the rules of the game were really beginning to shift, and in a way that was moving us towards the influence of authoritarian regimes and away from democratic principles, governance, and alliances. And that was extremely worrying to us. When COVID hit, we saw a lot of these dynamics closer to home, right? When we all went through this in terms of trying to source PPE from China and not having that available to us as we needed it. Pharmaceuticals that were not available, medical devices that we could no longer bring into the country in the way that we needed. And this started, of course, a very big conversation around critical supply chains and how as a country, we need to be much more careful about being able to respond to these kinds of risks. And I think it's the case in any country because the experiences were similar in Canada and Mexico and other places where this reliance, this dependency on trading partners and countries that may not share our democratic principles, our governance principles, adds another layer of complexity to what's happening in the world. And this rising strategic competition between the US and China really starting to take shape and being laid bare through COVID. So we began to take this concept of AllyShoring, which came out of some conversations around the research that I mentioned, and wanted to explore it further as a way to temper some of the conversation around the idea that we could bring all of our supply chains back from China, even though that might be an ideal situation. It's not really a realistic one. And we don't really want to decouple completely with anybody. We live in a global interconnected world, but there are many cases where critical supply chains need to be closer to home, or at least need to be connected into economies where we have a strong sense of shared values. And we define that as ally shoring. So ally shoring describes the process by which countries network their critical supply chains, source essential materials, goods, services, between and among trusted partners and allies, with the idea of strengthening both economic and national security. That's really the concept. And we think that the timing is perfect for this conversation, and specifically how it can apply to some of our closest relationships. And that, of course, includes our friends in Mexico and Canada, where we have the basis of strong integrated economies and supply chains, but where we can go even further. But I think what distinguishes the concept of ally shoring is the idea that we treat each other as allies, not so much in a transactional trade partnership mode, of course that's part of it, but that we really come together around the concept of shared governance principles. And this is important because we're trying to create the environment where we thrive in a secure way, and where we protect our critical institutions, our governing institutions, from the impact of authoritarian regimes, digital surveillance, and some of the other threats that are now emerging. So the idea of more tightly intertwined supply chains and economies, but based on a strong governing framework and based on the concept of alliances, is really what we're talking about. This is particularly critical right now, as we think about, and Enrique really alluded to this, how industries and manufacturing and supply chains are evolving in the 21st century. And by that, I mean the huge move forward around artificial intelligence, biotechnology, biomedical services, quantum computing, renewable energy sources, financial technology or fintech, water treatment and sanitation. These areas that are deemed transformational exports by the US and by many other countries. So we have an opportunity to think through where we go in the future and how we choose to integrate. And that's really what we're talking about here. So it's a framework to think about what we're doing in a much more strategic way, and hopefully to pull all of us along together with the idea that we're creating new jobs in the US, we create new jobs in Mexico, new jobs in Canada through this integrated process. No country is in a position to source all of its components and subcomponents within its own territory. It just doesn't exist anymore. So we need to rely on each other. That's the reality. And there may be cases where we want to onshore some of our supply chains, and where it makes sense to do that, we should. But it's not at the expense of building a system where we can work together more effectively. So that's the basic concept. I'm going to turn it over to John to talk a little bit about the benefits, and then we'll come back to the more operational question of how would we begin to move this concept of ally shoring into a reality. Thank you.
Thanks, Elaine, and thanks, Enrico, and I know Sergio cut off, but it's a real privilege to be able to join with you and hopefully work together with you to promote this idea and make it more real. As Elaine indicated, while she kind of left her work in the US and started worrying about international security issues, I have been in Michigan and in the Midwest for some 25, 30 years. My work focused with Brookings and Chicago Council and my own think tank about how do we accelerate economic development and change and transformation in this binational industrial heartland region. And that certainly informed me with an understanding that most of you probably have too, that we are so highly interdependent and intertwined in our economies and our supply chains that we don't so much trade with each other, US, Canada, Mexico in particular, as we manage a co-production system. A couple years ago, I looked at how much of the Midwest economies, the states here, in our trade, so-called trade with Mexico and Canada, what does that trade look like? And 50% of that trade with Canada is in intermediate goods, which mean components of a different, larger finished product. 30% of our so-called trade with Mexico is in intermediate products and goods, which really means we are managing, as I said, a powerful co-production system. And so I, like Elaine, but for somewhat different reasons, when our domestic leaders facing the cuts in our critical supply chains began jumping up and down, talking about we have to onshore this and that and or everything, I was somewhat mortified and pulling my hair out saying, no, it won't work. It would be wildly inefficient and costly to consumers if we did try. And if anything, let's take advantage of these highly efficient, well-machined global supply chains, but lean into them with, as Elaine said, the countries and the allies that share our values, that want to play by an open, rules-based, law-based trade and economic system, and do more together and produce more, rewire our supply chains with those who we can predictably and confidently work with and trust, while we rework our supply chains to not be dependent on any one entity or country, particularly those who might not share our values for a critical supply. So, we began to try to make this powerful argument, and I think we're, as Enrique alluded to, pleased. Initial concern that our US Biden administration might talk about domestic sourcing as the exclusive agenda, but have begun to talk even more robustly about, as Enrique said, friendshoring and AllyShoring are in the critical supply chain report. It's not always constructive nor desirable to onshore. And so we think there's such a powerful case to make to our leadership here in the US, which we've been eager to do, but also to Mexico, Canada, and our other allies, both business and political leadership, that AllyShoring is a real powerful program and strategy to meet US, Mexican, Canada, and our allies' economic, national security, and our political and foreign policy goals with a policy or program that can further those goals. So let me just tick off what's in the paper in terms of some of the top line benefits of AllyShoring when we do it with Mexico and any and all of our allies. Obviously, it decreases our reliance on any one country and our vulnerability to being either held hostage or over a barrel in our production relationships with anyone. It can speed our COVID response and our economic recovery if we work together to produce the supplies, materials, treatments, and we've begun to do some of that. It certainly can make our supply chains more reliable, resilient, more predictable as we lean into co-production with our friends and allies. The big point that Elaine mentioned, politically important, is helping folks understand we can create more good paying jobs on all sides of our borders in the US and Mexico and Canada by producing more together and working together as we rewire production systems and our critical supply chains. We can make more of the health and biomedical products and technologies together. We can build out our auto and automated and e-delivery vehicles and electric car production together. we can lay broadband infrastructures and do that to reach more people and places together and create more good jobs, as well as providing food and other critical supplies by partnering. And as Elaine, I think we'll talk a bit about at the end, there's so many growth sectors, emerging sectors, and she indicated some of this in her opening, you know, in all the IT-laced and advanced manufacturing sectors of the future, the automated and AI-driven, where we can exploit by working together, because we already produce many of these things together, and seize emerging markets in the rest of the world, which will create more and expand more businesses and jobs at home. Part of the argument for AllyShoring too is that it really, by strengthening our economies, which it can be a path to do that faster, we strengthen our democracies, we strengthen our political stabilities here and among our allies. And it also provides an offer to other countries of a partnership in economic development and infrastructure rebuilding that is different from what the Chinese are offering. I mean, Elaine wrote the book on what China's Belt and Road and other development support is. It's not an open, transparent, rules-based offer. It's often corrupting and dependency building. And we want to have other countries around the world have an alternative partner in economic development and co-production expansion with a family of allies and democracies that share a set of values about how we sort of set the rules for the economy and the polity of the world. In the paper, there's many additional particulars about the particular benefits for AllyShoring with Mexico, US-Mexico. And we really learned them by interviewing and talking to so many of you business leaders that work on both sides of the border. And you know, I won't talk about them all, but they range from the clearly closer, lower transportation costs, more predictable supply chains, that the fact that the supply chains are less opaque, the second, third, and fourth tier suppliers aren't some mystery world, as we do care about where things are coming from and sources of origin. Mexico businesses have competencies in so many of these critical and emerging sectors that match our own interests in the US for critical sectors and growth sectors that we want to and can co-produce together. In some cases, you know, while Canada is somewhat more expensive, Mexico is in many areas a low-cost provider that can help us replace other low-cost providers, but do it closer to home and more predictably. Mexico businesses have, they're nearby and have competencies in quick turnaround, customization, you know, high quality, small batch products as the world is demanding quick, customized, and we can take advantage of that opportunity, as well as a history of doing business together and sharing a culture and sharing a familiarity in our business to business and our cultural relationships that are an advantage to doing more together. And as we also argue, clearly it's in the US's security interests, as it is the Mexican government's, to create more good, stable, good paying jobs on both sides of the border. That's in the US's security interests, so it can reduce some of the pressure on migration and other things, which have been an unfortunate source of tension over the years. So there are many more particulars about why Mexico offers certain comparative advantages in AllyShoring with the US, and other allies have different assets and advantages, and often similar ones as well. But so we really think this is a powerful understanding of the path forward for all of us. And I think Elaine's going to close by talking about some of the specific tangibles of how we can press forward with AllyShoring that might be the most fruitful short-term steps. And again, I think we're both encouraged that our country's leaders appear to be getting it in some way and appreciating this and talking about working together with allies, not trying to domestic source or pull back home and pull away from the rest of the world, which is, in our view, a counterproductive both economic and political and foreign policy strategy. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So in the paper, we talk about 4 specific areas that we think could be part of operationalizing, if you will, the concept of AllyShoring. So I'm going to talk a little bit about those areas, but let me mention before that, just to pick up on John's thread about the Biden administration and getting traction. The administration has talked about and is likely, it looks, to host a summit for democracy. It may not be this year, it may be sometime early next year. We're still waiting on the dates for that. But we think that the common denominator of that conversation is likely to be around critical supply chains and how to work with allies to address that challenge. Certainly there will be other things, but the idea that the administration is moving towards this broader conversation with a community of trusted partners and allies is a great step forward. So we hope that this concept of AllyShoring will be part of that conversation in some way. But back to the 4 areas where we see an operational path forward. And the first is around lessons learned from COVID-19. You're all probably very well aware of some of the pivoting that occurred to make up for those shortages that we were talking about, whether it was PPE or medical devices, pharmaceuticals. In some cases, we have these excellent examples of manufacturers in Mexico pivoting their operations to produce more PPE that was eventually exported to the US. General Motors, for example, did that at one of their facilities. So we have some capacity within the system for this type of critical pivot. But we think there are many more areas where it could have happened. But it's not an easy thing to do when you haven't laid the groundwork around exactly what the response effort looks like and how you identify critical commodities and supply chains. And right now, we don't have a consistency across that effort between the US and Mexico, and to some extent, the US and Canada. So there's opportunity to learn from the COVID response before we all forget, before we file it away and pretend that it didn't happen, right? There's a tremendous amount that can be done to prepare for the next shock. And whether it takes the form of a pandemic or something else, we don't know. But it won't be the last time that we're tested in this highly interconnected world in which we live. So that's the first area. The second area is around transformational exports, and I mentioned some of those areas: quantum computing, wireless communications, renewable energy, fintech. These are emerging areas or where we see existing sectors like automotive going through massive transformation and moving into mobility, right? A much broader concept for the automotive world. And here we have the opportunity to think more strategically as we develop new capacities, as we upskill and reskill our human resource assets, our people, right? Our greatest resource. How do we do that to improve portability of skills? How do we ensure, again, that we have the right alliances in place so that if we're facing a challenge that we're not impacting critical supply chains, particularly those that are tied into economic security and national security. So we need to look at those areas and then hopefully drive investments more specifically around these partnerships. So we mentioned some of the new authorities available through the Development Finance Corporation, which has taken on the existing OPIC pipeline and has also extended to offer equity investments outside of the US. This is a very powerful tool. It will continue to grow, I believe, in terms of its popularity and ability to drive US investment towards high quality infrastructure and other areas where we're not only supporting connections and opportunity in the host country, but also supporting and strengthening our own capacities. So we need to look at that. We need to look at Exim Bank and their work on countering China and these transformational export opportunities where the US can expand its ability to produce, for example, in biomedical, but not without the help from other countries. So where can Mexico in particular begin to fill some of these very critical gaps? The third area is around the smart border. So we know that in order to create the kind of connectivity that we're talking about, that we need the best possible border infrastructure, whether it's serving the movement of people or the movement of goods, or in this case, really both under an AllyShoring concept. Our borders need to be 21st century state of the art. We've gotten better around border efficiency, but it's not as good as it should be. And we need to drive more investment in that space. It will pay huge dividends, both in the short term and the long term. And then finally, picking up on John's comment on rule of law, one of the areas that our manufacturers, when we were developing this paper for the foundation, the manufacturers all pointed towards was the importance of having consistent rule of law and a regulatory environment, stability around the economy and the investment space that would allow for foreign direct investment to really flow into a country. And this, we think, is a really critical part of AllyShoring, because we can work together to strengthen the institutions, the know-how, and the ability to create that environment that then allows for foreign direct investment from many places. And that's good for everyone. So those are the 4 areas where we think there are opportunities to move ahead. We hope that this concept creates some interest, and we would look forward to continuing this conversation and taking any questions. So Enrique, again, thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Elaine, and thank you, John. Jorge, we can start the Q&A session. Let me just throw something here, and John and Elaine, if you want to answer that. But I'm seeing a lot of let's say strategies, Elaine, and tools that the U.S. Administration is using to incentivize or disincentivize the reshoring or the production out there. Obviously, the use of technology in the border could be, an incentive with other countries to trade more, but also investment with partners in infrastructure through DFC or through USAID. There are others like rules of origin, right? Trying to keep all the supply chains in a region, like the rules of origin we have in the automotive industry with the USMCA. They are incentives, economic incentives to US companies not to go out, or even taxes for companies that are producing out there. And they are also, we are hearing here in US about a potential tax to countries that are not energy clean, right? So obviously US can use a lot of tools. Can you talk a little bit about the tools that are more effective in this context to reshore production or to trade with allies in this case?
Sure. There's so much going on right now, Enrique, and I think your question highlights just how complicated it is, right? Because it's not only the question about responding to COVID and critical supply chains and global alliances, it's the climate conversation, it's the energy conversation. It's happening on so many fronts. And then you add in domestic political challenges, which many countries are facing, and it's kind of a hodgepodge of stuff, right? And so I think on the one hand, it's challenging to get all of this framed in a way that makes sense and is crystal clear. But on the other hand, there are some things happening at maybe at the secondary level, which are quite interesting, and where we kind of need to put our claws into the good work that's being done, and some of the policy changes that on the face of it may not look that important, but have the potential to really reshape how we do business and how we think about AllyShoring. So one example, which we've talked about before, is what's happening with Exim Bank. So Exim Bank is responsible for creating jobs in the US. That is their congressional mandate, create more jobs. So you would think that an onshoring strategy would be the right way for EXIM to do that. But actually, they've taken a very different approach when it comes to countering China and protecting transformational export areas. They've dropped the US content requirement. It used to be 80% for specific areas, and now it's being dropped to 50% for any area considered transformational, like the ones that I mentioned. So why is this important? It's important because it opens up opportunity for Mexican manufacturers and potentially others to fill the gap, to help US manufacturers export more by filling out those supply chains. So this is really important because, in fact, it looks like the policy is moving in a different direction, but actually it's a very logical step for being more competitive globally. So these are the kinds of things that we need to look towards, and where it would be very helpful to have our allies, business interests focused on really using those mechanisms. Another one that I'll mention is a recent effort between the US, Japan, and Australia called the Blue Dot Network. It's being executed, if you will, through the OECD, but the idea is to create standards for high quality global infrastructure development and to bring in more partners who have like-minded views around how to do that. And it's specifically, although they don't really advertise it as such, it is a specific response to the Belt and Road Initiative. So these things are happening, and there are many others that we could talk about. And it's where we just need to pay attention and really drive the outcomes from these really important tools that we now have available.
Enrique, could I just add, well, yeah, there may be, and it seems, and Elaine knows more about this than I do, a mixed bag of incentive structures seem to be flowing from our country, but we're on a AllyShoring and related 1-year anniversary of USMCA webinar, where Chris Sands of the Wilson Center was pointing out the USMCA got improvement on NAFTA, but it also it builds in a set of incentives, really, and commitments to accelerate progress on a host of things, that from harmonizing regulations to making headway on environmental and social goals, to embedding North American domestic content requirements, which are reward any and all investments on any sides of our border with additional job and spillovers on the other sides of the border. But I think his main point was the trade authority has now lapsed for negotiating similar arrangements, U.S. with other allies around the world. So if anything, there's opportunity now and a mechanism to do more ally shoring under and accelerate progress on USMCA goals, which at least we baked in to the cake before it became too late.
Thank you, John and Elaine. Jorge?
Yes, Enrique, thanks so much. We have a couple of questions. For the audience, you can share your questions using the Q&A tool in the lower right corner, so we can share those with our guests. For now, we have a very interesting question, John and Elaine, and it's about AllyShoring. Sounds like an obvious strategy to strengthen the North American region, but this will not be possible if the institutions are weak. What do you propose to make sure institutions in all countries, but especially in Mexico, remain strong and independent from personality of the leader of government? Who can answer this question?
Sure, I'll jump in on that.
Go ahead.
Thank you. It's a great question. It's something we certainly thought about, and is a particular interest of mine on the governance front. So to make AllyShoring work, we do need to pay attention to the institutions. And it comes back to this notion that economic systems and policies are driven by political dynamics, always. Sometimes we forget. We think the markets drive everything. Well, no, it's the rules of the game. It's the institutions. It's the framework that allows the market to exist in the way that we want it to. So when the institutions begin to become too fragile, are weakened, co-opted, we have problems. And that's particularly the case in a democracy, less so in an authoritarian structures, right, where centralized control and takeover of institutions is part of the operating environment. So one thing that's of great concern is a regression around democratic institutions and principles, and we do have some worrying challenges around that, particularly in the Western Hemisphere. So one of the most important things from my perspective about AllyShoring is deepening that conversation around where we can be helpful on institutional reform and engagement. And it's not to suggest that the US or any country has all the answers for another country, but it's simply to give the right kind of support to allow for a country to strengthen its own institutions, because it makes sense to do so in the context of a stronger allied relationship, and to support the rules of the game and the economic systems and environment that we need, right, for our joint economic security. So how to do that, of course, is always the challenging part. Countries spend a lot of money trying to do that through various forms of assistance. I think we need to just rethink that whole process of how we do that and link it into the idea that we are long-term allies that have similar objectives for institutional strength and reform.
John, you want to jump in? You are with your microphone off.
No, I can't add anything to Elaine's good answer.
Great. We have another one. Is from Adrian Gonzalez from the COMEXI. And he asked if you can talk more about the sectors with the most potential for AllyShoring. And also, he asked what will be the main challenges the high-level economic dialogue will face in the short term. I think the economic dialogue will be a very important mechanism in this way. What do you think?
Let me start off, and Elaine, I'm sure, can add value or improve on my answer. We've talked a bit about the co-production relationships we already have, business to business, know what those are in so many sectors. But Elaine really talked too about two areas where we think are opportunities. We had already, in the US side, identified some critical sectors, critical supply chain sectors that we wanted to both protect and rewire, and also these transformational sectors of opportunity for building out our ability to make kind of win the future in a variety of key emerging sectors. So those two areas, from our point of view, would be the places to start. But the way to start, it would be to animate or reanimate the kind of high-level CEO with national government support dialogue, the Competitiveness Council that did have CEOs in those sectors, or whatever sectors we want to focus on between our three countries, meeting and plotting together with the support of our governments. How are we going to both rewire and expand our footprint in these sectors? Because obviously the business leaders are the ones that know where we are and know perhaps how we could get to the next step, but they need support from our national government. So that might be one mechanism to reanimate, which I gather kind of languished under the past administration, and hopefully something we can reanimate to really focus on these opportunities. Elaine, do you have some better ideas, I think?
Definitely not better. Maybe just adding a couple of thoughts. Because of COVID, I think we have an idea of some of the critical supply chains that have been at risk for most countries, whether it's PPE or pharmaceuticals or medical supplies. I think we should start with the areas where we know we have these dependencies and problems, and where we can connect it into our joint national security interests. So that's the first step. Then the second step would be the identification of additional critical areas that pose a problem now or potentially in the future if we're dependent upon a single source for that supply chain, and it happens to be in a country where we have a challenge. It's not just China, there may be some others on that list. So we need to really go through this in a more systematic and methodological approach. We also need to remember that the private sector owns the vast majority of and operates the vast majority of supply chains, right? With only a few exceptions. So without the business leaders at the table, I'm not sure that we would find success with this because the decisions around pivoting are very much driven by business interests and by the business community. That also takes us one step back to thinking about the governing structures of corporations and shareholders and what the expectations are. So there's a whole conversation there that really needs to get started.
Yeah, very interesting. I think we have time for one more. And talking about challenges, Andrea Navarro give us a comment and a couple of questions about about the importance of Mexico and the United States as strategic border allies in also essential to strengthen the workforce and reduce the entry of migrants to the United States from the South and Central America border. But what will be the strategy to assist Mexico at the border when improving jobs and increasing wages in an attractive factor for migrants who cannot pass to the United States? This is one question. And the second one is, in what way do you think that reinforcing jobs and wages for workers will help Mexico at the border without encouraging the migrant force to stay in this country? I think Andrea is relating these kind of challenges through the strategies like AllyShoring, how that can help to create more jobs around the border. Right? What do you think, Elaine?
It's a great question. And I think we have a huge opportunity with AllyShoring to reframe the conversation around migration, skills development, mobility across the border, and what that means to strengthen businesses and operations anywhere within the realm of an AllyShoring construct. I think we've become beholden to an immigration rhetoric that has been completely unhelpful in solving the problems. It's also detracted, in the case of the US-Mexico relationship, from the very deep economic integration and the longstanding partnership that we've had as two countries who have worked together, just like the US and Canada. Of course, we have different dimensions with Mexico, but I see the migration challenge as part and parcel to this. It's a structural issue that doesn't have a silver bullet solution. But if we can begin to build in the discussion around what it means to upskill and reskill and move people into jobs that are needed in a new economy, now we're talking about something really valuable. And then using the tools that are available to us to quickly help people move into a skilled environment. And then creating those opportunities, because we're creating more for everyone by expanding the reach of our supply chains and working together to do that. So all of these things work in tandem. I don't mean to imply by laying it out in 30 seconds that this isn't in any way an easy problem, but we can have a better conversation about how to get there if we are really thinking about the connection as an alliance of partners, not as simply trading partners and neighbors who sometimes talk to each other.
Could I just add?
Yeah, please.
As I mentioned, more good paying jobs for people in Mexico certainly contributes to diminishing any migration pushes from Mexico. But as you all know, I think the bigger challenge we face are migration through Mexico from Central and other American countries that have bigger problems. I mean, I would hope that we might take advantage, as Elaine said, of this moment, and AllyShoring taken to its ultimate case would be for our leadership to begin to communicate the goals that they say of tackling root conditions in those Central American countries that drive the immigration, but to do so by saying, look, we are committed to a strategy to bring businesses that might be far flung in their development and get them closer to us and their critical supply chains, but for us to incentivize or facilitate business and job growth in Central American countries, you've got to get serious and show that you can crack down or diminish corruption, gang violence, et cetera. That to me would be a more constructive quid pro quo of saying, we'll help you grow more businesses and jobs, but only if you are serious about playing by the rule of law and not running a corrupt and or violent, permitting a violent state, because that would tackle the root conditions most powerfully.
Yeah, I agree with you. And probably in that regard, another question interesting is, well, some states and enterprises are looking to achieve greater resilience of the value chains, of course, and thinking on strategies like AllyShoring. But however, reshoring or nearshoring probably in some extent could affect the efficiency of the global value chains. I mean, there are some aspects that probably cannot help to have more efficiency. So can AllyShoring help countries like Mexico, US, and Canada to find the correct balance between resilience and efficiency? Who want to jump in?
Well, I'd just say to start, part of why we believe that this AllyShoring construct has power in multiple dimensions and is more sort of politically and economically potent, is that it's not talking about unwinding highly efficient supply chains. It is talking about rewiring them. As you know, this phone in my pocket has components from 57 countries, and it's not affordable if we substitute the low-cost components that are made in far-flung countries. That's why we need a lot of low-cost producers in the value chain if we're going to make something that anybody can afford, including our own country. So that's why let's work and frame it. Let's work with countries, including low-cost producers in the developing world. And as I said, China's not a low-cost producer anymore, but Mexico is on par in cost structure and many of the things that China and others, do well. But other countries that are even lower cost need to be part of the AllyShoring food chain. And that's how we can make it work to keep the efficiencies that were created by this. Again, it's the global business community that highly machined these to be incredibly efficient, just in time, supply chains. And we saw what happens when that is cracked by one supply component not being there. And so that's why we need reliable, predictable, and but also efficient supply chains as we rewire them to cut out folks where we feel we should cut them out, because they are either, we don't want to have to rely on them in a pinch, or we don't want to have hostage to them piggybacking with AI or stealing IP or whatever the issue is for us. That's very selfish from our point of view.
I would just add a couple of thoughts to that. The first is that there has been a shift. We don't know if it's permanent, but it might be. When we think about this concept and the mindset around just in time, and the movement towards just in case, which is really now where we are in the conversation around resilience of supply chains. It's more of a just in case mentality. I think that's actually very healthy because I think we've done a pretty bad job of understanding the true costs of sourcing from certain parts of the world. We measure the efficiencies in terms of the transport costs, the time to market, the production time, all the things that one would think. But how do we actually bake into this model the cost of a long-term dependency on a country that doesn't share our interests and seeks to undermine our rules of engagement around the trading system? What is that? So I think we have to really reconsider how we think about costs associated with production, and then the conversation gets a little bit easier, but perhaps also more consistent around what it means to manufacture close to home versus far away. The other thing that will probably play into this more and more is the climate crisis and how people cost long haul transport of goods. We really haven't done that in a way that's captured all of the costs, and I think that is going to change.
Yeah, and I just add that we need to take in account the technological or digitalization process around the global value chains. I mean, that will impact in a different way as we know today. So probably that will help to have more short global value chains, but with more resilience and efficiency. We will see, right? We are getting into the time. Enrique, do you want to make a final comment?
Thank you, Jorge, and thank you again to COMEXI for hosting this event with the U.S.-Mexico Foundation. A couple of thoughts. One is, I mean, we have the USMCA already in place. 1 year, in the next 5 years, I believe we're going to have this sunset clause, and the policymakers will need to analyze if the USMCA that they make was useful and beneficial for the entire society in North America. So we need to start thinking on strategies in how to measure also the benefits of the USMCA. We see the USMCA as a tremendous platform. You can use it or you cannot use it, right? And we see AllyShoring as a strategy, right? It's different. The USMCA is the platform. AllyShoring could be one of other strategies that we can implement to bring more investment, jobs, technology, knowledge, competitiveness to the region, right? There is an additional challenge, Jorge, that is the state level, right? In Mexico, we're seeing a lot of investment, a lot of production, a lot of trade with the northern states, right? Chihuahua, it's in the top of the list. Then Coahuila, Nuevo León, Sonora, Baja California. Those states are in the top of the mind of many investors in the US and globally, right? Because they are very close to US, because they have the talent, and because they already have the platform, the production platform, right? Cities like Mexicali, Tijuana, Juarez, Monterrey. Well, I mean, I believe they will have a huge benefit on this relocalization of suppliers. But we need to think on the south of Mexico and also in the center, right? Bajío is doing pretty well, but they will need to promote. We will need to promote. Same thing in the US side, right? There are some states like Texas and Arizona that are taking a lot of investment, semiconductors, technology, telecom, but could be some states, in the tail of the progress, and could be some social challenges ahead of us. And just to conclude, Jorge, let me ask all the attendees in this event to communicate, to share the document. I think could be an amazing strategy between Mexico, US, and Canada to implement the AllyShoring. We need to communicate. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's friendly shoring, AllyShoring, or I mean, whatever else, but we believe in this concept, obviously. But help the U.S.-Mexico Foundation and help COMEXI to communicate this narrative, this positive narrative for the future of both countries. Thank you very much again, Jorge and Sergio Alcocer, and all the people at COMEXI. John, Elaine, thank you very much for your time. I know you are promoting this concept all around US and Mexico and Canada, and we need to continue doing it. Thank you again.
Totally agree. Thank you, Enrique. Thank you, Elaine, John.
Thank you.
Our pleasure.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.